On primetime politics tonight, the federal government pushes ahead with emergency orders, even as most blockades and protests in Canada come to an end. And the divisive tone in the House results in calls for the Prime Minister to apologize. MPs will debate the latest developments. Is a police crackdown coming for protesters in Ottawa? I'll speak with the mayor of the nation's capital on the latest moves. And our panel of parliamentary journalists will also be here to discuss the protests and the party line. And we'll begin tonight with the continuing debate over the unprecedented federal emergency orders to deal with blockades and protests. All of the protest trouble spots really in the country have now been resolved, except for the ongoing protests/occupation here in Ottawa, which has lasted 20 days now. Today, police issued warnings to protesters to leave or face charges and even arrest, as government ministers justified the new orders in part by saying some protesters here in Ottawa are linked to dangerous criminal activity. The emergency orders prohibit bringing children under the age of 18 to participate in trucker convoy protests, traveling to or from a protest site with the intention of taking part or offering support such as supplying fuel, traveling to Canada as a foreign national with the intention of participating in convoy protests, taking part in so-called slow rolling by motorists intent on impeding the free flow of traffic. Crowdfunding sites must also register with a federal financial oversight body if they're in possession or control of any funds associated with the convoy. Officials are also designating areas such as airports, ports, truck depots, hospitals, trade corridors, and international crossings as protected. Those new measures also give banks the power to freeze accounts of protesters. Today in the House of Commons, the debate focused on why the orders are needed.
The Prime Minister has more of a political emergency on his hands than a national emergency. The borders at Coutts, Surrey, Windsor and Emerson have all been cleared. There are no more blockades at any borders. Trucks are still here downtown in Ottawa and they need to move. But in light of the rapidly changing landscape, can the Prime Minister tell us where is the serious threat of violence to Canadians for ideological purposes, which is the threshold that needs to be met for the Emergencies Act?
Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the invocation of the Emergencies Act is not something to be done lightly. It is not something to be done as a first resort or even a second resort. But it was necessary to be done to give local law enforcement across the country the tools to handle these illegal blockades, to be able to ensure restoration of order and to make sure that Canadians, whether they're losing shifts or seeing supplies delayed on the way through the borders, be able to get back to their daily lives. This is a decision we took, and of course, Parliament is going to have an opportunity to debate it.
Well, the Prime Minister was also under fire in the House today for comments he made about Conservative supporters of the protest. It came in response to a question from Ontario Conservative MP Melissa Lantsman, a descendant of Holocaust survivors.
Conservative Party members can stand with people who wave swastikas. They can stand with people who wave the Confederate flag. We will choose to stand with Canadians who deserve to be able to get to their jobs, who be able to get their lives back. These illegal protests need to stop, and they will, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I am a strong Jewish woman and a member of this House and a descendant of Holocaust survivors, and I have never it's never been singled out, and I have never been made to feel less, except for today when the Prime Minister accused me of standing with swastikas. I think he owes me an apology. I'd like an apology, and I think he owes an apology to all members of this House.
All right, let's bring in three members of Parliament now to debate the latest developments in the House today. Rachel Bendayan is a Quebec Liberal MP and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism. Dane Lloyd is an Alberta Conservative MP and his party's critic for emergency preparedness. And Alistair MacGregor is the BC MP and the public safety critic for the NDP. It's good to see you all. Look, let's start with the tone of the debate we saw in the House today. Rachel Bendayan, let me start with you. You are a Jewish member of Parliament. Did the Prime Minister go too far in his comments today in question period, telling a Jewish Conservative MP, accusing her party of standing with people who wave swastikas?
Well, thanks for the question. And obviously, I was in the chamber during question period today and heard the exchange. mean, quite honestly, the Prime Minister and anybody answering questions in the House is answering the Speaker, as you know very well. The way question period works, we do address questions and answers to the Speaker. The Prime Minister was not addressing any particular member, but I myself did personally see a Conservative member film a video standing beside a flag that contained a swastika. I can only imagine that would have been what the Prime Minister was referring to. I think that it's important to remember that we were not accusing or addressing any one person in particular, but that we have, and I have been distressed to see a Conservative member stand beside the swastika.
Okay.
In general, we have seen the Conservatives continue to promote this blockade.
The person asking the question, yes, it typically channels through the Speaker. The person asking the question is a descendant of Holocaust survivors, and how should
and
she?
He did not refer to her in particular. Certainly not.
Okay, Mr. Lloyd, let me hear you on this. You also rose in question period to object to this and ask for the Prime Minister to apologize. Why do you think he needs to apologize here?
Well, I think it's a ridiculous spin from the Liberal member to say that it's being addressed to the Speaker. It's not being addressed to the MP. We know full well that the Prime Minister loves using inflammatory and divisive language to divide and wedge Canadians. And I think he got caught in a situation where he thought he was saying something clever, but in fact, he was saying something deeply, deeply offensive to all members of the House, all members of the Conservative caucus, and particularly to a Conservative member of Parliament who is Jewish. So the idea that the Prime Minister was not intending this remark to be pointed at her is absolutely ludicrous. And I would remind the Liberal member on the panel that the Prime Minister has been taken, pictures of him have been taken with swastikas in the background, and no member of our caucus would stoop so low as to accuse him of standing with people who wave swastikas.
All right. So the demand for an apology stands. Mr. MacGregor, let me hear you on this, and I guess in the broader sense of the tone this debate has taken over these measures in Canada, the protests and so on, and where you think we're at.
Well, it's quite obvious to anyone who's watching Question Period today that the temperature is at a boiling point. And I do think all members of Parliament do need to step back so we can find some constructive ways to address this. Apart from what happened in Question Period today, there were worrying signs from the get-go when the occupation started in Ottawa. We did see Nazi paraphernalia. We saw Stars of David being used. We also saw a Confederate flag. And so if we want to find a constructive way to address this, my colleague Peter Julian brought in a private member's bill that seeks to address these symbols of hate. And I hope that we can find an all-party consensus to agree to that type of legislation so that these symbols of hate are in fact banned from ever being used in a public space in Canada.
All right, let's talk about where we are in terms of the process of emergency orders here. Rachel Bendayan, all of the protests except for the one here in Ottawa, all of the border blockades, they've now been resolved without the need of the emergency orders. So tell me why the orders are still needed.
Well, we see very much so as we walk into Parliament every day that the Ottawa siege is still ongoing. And I would also point to the fact that just earlier today, there was an attempted blockade once again of the bridge at Windsor, which was successfully cleared by law enforcement today. But there is an ongoing threat to our borders. There is a need for the federal government to intervene at the request, I might say, of different premiers. We saw that Premier Doug Ford welcomed the introduction by our government of the Emergency Measures Act. And so we are here to help, as we have been from the beginning, with all of the tools at our disposal.
Mr. Lloyd, Conservatives have said they will vote against these emergency orders. Why don't you and your Conservative Party members believe they're needed?
Because we don't believe that the government has met the threshold that's laid out in the Emergencies Act. The Emergencies Act has 4 criteria, and the one that's pertinent to this case is a public order disturbance. And this has to be an issue that is a national crisis. And we're talking about, a few hundred protesters in downtown Ottawa. As you said, law enforcement at the border crossings has been successful without the use of the Emergencies Act at de-escalating the situation. and removing the blockades. For the Prime Minister to invoke a never-before-used act that gives him extraordinary powers at this time is completely unnecessary, and it's political overreach.
Mr. MacGregor, why your leader and your party have expressed support for these measures with some caveats on how you want them applied, but why do you think they're still needed if under current tools for law enforcement they're able to resolve the protests and blockades we've been seeing in this country?
Well, I mean, with respect to Mr. Lloyd, we are at an unprecedented time. It's quite evident from the last 2 weeks that there has been a failure in federal leadership, which has led us to this point. And, you know, with regard to his comments about this being a few protesters, no, this is an occupation. It ceased being a protest a couple of weeks ago. It is now an occupation. It has blockaded some of our major border crossings with the United States. We have small businesses, we have working families that are being impacted by this. And so, yes, they are extraordinary powers, but it's very important to remember they are subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There are ways for parliamentary oversight to make sure that they are selectively applied.
Right. Are you saying existing powers that police and law enforcement officials possess wouldn't have been able to clear out this demonstration if maybe action had been taken earlier?
Well, again, the powers probably do exist, but whether they have actually been used, that, of course, we can see is not the case. So I think because the federal government was not there to coordinate intelligence and the activities of law enforcement from the get-go, we are now at the step where this unfortunately has to be used so that working families are not feeling the pinch from these occupations any longer than is necessary.
Rachel Bendayan, the Public Safety Minister, repeatedly today alluded to connections between some of the Ottawa protesters and those involved in the border blockade in Coutts, Alberta, who were allegedly armed and have been charged now with threatening to kill police officers. He used that in many ways as a justification to say, look, this might be what's going on. This is what we think is going on. That's why we need these orders. What connections, what evidence does the government have that that's what's happening in Ottawa, that there is this connection?
Look, there was a cache of weapons that was found in Coutts, Alberta. We are seeing that our borders are under threat. I mean, it is unprecedented to have the Canadian border literally blocked. Just at Windsor alone, we are talking about $400 million a day in goods that we're unable to cross. It is important to our government and indeed to all Canadians that we continue to be in control of our territory and of our borders.
But are we to understand from the comments say that the government believes there are members of the protest in Ottawa who are in that, call it an occupation if you want, who are armed in the streets of Ottawa? And if they are, what should police be doing about that?
I think that it is up to the police to conduct those kinds of investigations. And of course, we are concerned about linkages between the different protests across the country. As my colleague mentioned, I don't even believe that we should be calling them protests anymore. Protests are a form of expression covered under the Charter. What we are seeing are illegal blockades. And that is why we have brought in the extraordinary measures under the Act that we're discussing with you today. And we will have the opportunity to debate that legislation in the House.
Mr. Lloyd, how concerned are you about the possibility that there are protesters in Ottawa who are armed in the streets of Ottawa, and what should police be doing about that?
Well, let me start by saying that this militant faction at Coutts, which was brought down by the RCMP before the invocation of the Emergency Act, should be tried to the fullest extent of the law. This is absolutely unacceptable. But what I would say is that as far as Ottawa goes, I'm not concerned because the Parliamentary Protective Services and the RCMP have not warned members of Parliament to stay away from Parliament Hill. We're going to work. So if there was real hard intelligence that there was such a threat to us, I don't know how the government would be responsible in allowing us to sit in the House of Commons at this time.
Mr. MacGregor, when you hear those kinds of links between protesters arrested in Alberta and those who are taking part in what's happening in Ottawa, what more do you want to know?
Well, I will trust our law enforcement agencies to take an appropriate and measured response anytime they're sending in their service members. I think they do a very professional job in doing so. But again, while members of Parliament may not have received direct threats, I think some have, in fact. We really have to keep our focus on the businesses and workers in downtown Ottawa and the residents who have been subjected to an occupation now for more than 2 weeks.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you all for your time tonight. I do appreciate it, and we'll talk again. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim Watson is the Mayor of Ottawa. Mayor Watson, thanks for taking time to speak with me again. Good to see you. I guess the question everyone in your city wants answered is, when will these protesters be leaving town? What can you tell them?
Well, I know today, for instance, the police went out with notices that I have right here to let them know that they should be vacating the space. This has gone on far too long, Peter. You know, it was started as a protest. It's turned into be an occupation. And the residents of this city have just had enough, particularly the people who live in and around the parliamentary precinct. So I can't tell you when the police will take action. Obviously, that's their prerogative, and they wouldn't share that with the public in any event because they want to have the element of surprise, quite frankly. But there's certainly a desire to have this resolved quickly, safely, and peacefully. And that's certainly the directions that the chief understands has to be followed through,
right.
And I have great confidence in our new chief to do that.
But the protesters have been warned in the past that they're breaking the law and they have to leave, and by and large they ignored those warnings. Many of the people we saw today were ignoring the flyers and leaflets being handed out, the warnings being handed out by police today. So what's the next step as far as you know? After warnings are passed around, what next?
Well, it's if the individuals don't leave voluntarily, obviously there'll be a police intervention. That's our only option. We now have significant additional resources from the RCMP and the OPP, and we thank the two orders of government. We've been on the phone for the last several days with federal ministers and the Premier and the Prime Minister, and they're now starting to provide us with the resources we need to make sure that any operation is a success and we bring this to a safe and peaceful conclusion. We have, as you know, put up with a lot over the course of the last 3 weeks. This has turned into a carnival, and it's just a disgrace to the people who are suffering in the center town neighborhoods, Lower Town, and Byward Market. And we're putting every resource possible into getting this situation resolved sooner than later. You know, we know on weekends the rowdiness becomes even more of a problem. And we want this to stop as quickly as possible. Where
are you in the debate over whether emergency powers were actually needed, whether the government needed to invoke those? And a lot of people say, look, municipalities such as yours have all the powers they need to end protests like this. Where are you on that?
Well, the Emergency Act proposed by the federal government does actually help us. It allows us to force, for instance, tow truck companies to comply with police orders. The financial issues that are in the Act that hit people in the pocketbook is another thing that I think will be helpful. Preventing people under the age of 18 in these kinds of areas is helpful. Providing geographic footprint of the areas that are banned from these kinds of protests will help the City of Ottawa. So there are a number of elements of the Emergency Act that actually help us and help our police officers do their job more quickly and more efficiently.
Have you been given any indication that tow truck companies, even under the power of law, I guess, are prepared to obey those orders where safety might be an issue, repercussions might be an issue, that they're prepared to follow those orders and come and tow trucks and vehicles away if they are ordered to do so?
I'm not aware that's an operational matter that obviously the police are involved with discussions with tow truck companies. The city has a number of tow trucks as well, so we have that capacity locally.
There is a new command structure. I think you sort of touched on it with the RCMP, the local interim police chief here, the OPP, all part. What should we expect that to change? And I guess why is it happening on day 20?
Yeah, it's an integrated command center that coordinates the activities, because we now have 3 police forces. More than that, actually, we have others from Toronto and Hamilton. You know, they've been very good municipal partners to bring in police officers from other jurisdictions, public order officers as well. So it's going to be integrated. The word integration means that we share information so the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. Lots of time to do a postmortem. I have a lot of questions why this was allowed to fester as long as it did. My view is that after the protest rally had taken place on the Saturday, they should be moving on the Sunday. Instead, it was built up and it's become a cause célèbre. We get more and more people coming, and it makes it more difficult for the police to act, but the police will act.
Do you think we'll see trucks here by the weekend, or will the city be clear?
Well, I think regardless of what happens and when it happens, it's going to take longer than a few days to clear out everything from, the mess that they've created in terms of, Johnny on the spots and sound systems and huts and towers and speakers and so on. That's going to take some time, and it's going to cost us a fortune. It's a mess down there, people defecating and urinating and so on in front of Parliament Hill. It's an absolute disgrace, and the sooner they leave the city, the better. Go back to your provincial capitals, lobby and argue with your provincial politicians. They have most of the mandates. We need to get our lives back. We need the residents of Ottawa to reclaim their city as quickly as possible.
Just in the next few seconds we have left here, what's your biggest concern now?
Well, obviously that it turns into a dangerous situation for both our police officers, our residents, and the protesters. The protesters have it in their ability to pick up, get in their trucks, leave, go back home, unless they're charged, obviously, criminally. But we have many more tools now that will hit those individuals in the pocketbook, and their life savings has gone into their truck. The city can possess that and sell it. So there is little incentive for these individuals to stay in our nation's capital. It's time for them to move.
All right. Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson, appreciate your time again today. Good to talk to you. Take care, Mayor.
Thanks, Peter. Bye-bye.
All right, I want to bring in three colleagues now from the Parliamentary Press Gallery to talk about the latest developments. Marieke Walsh is a reporter with the Globe and Mail. Tonda MacCharles is a reporter with the Toronto Star. And Joël-Denis Bellavance is the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for La Presse. Good to see you all. Marieke, let me start with you. The only significant protest really left in the country as we speak is the ongoing one in Ottawa. The other protests and blockades have all been resolved under existing laws and authorities. How do you think that's affecting the government's narrative on the need for these emergency orders now?
Well, we see the government still trying to tie the resolution of those border blockades to the Emergencies Act, saying that it's needed to ensure those blockades remain cleared, that they do not start new ones. And so we've seen, I think, the government trying to adjust part of their language to make it more forward-looking in preventing more blockades, but they are clearly tying it to blockades like the one in Coutts, Alberta. They say that they're tying the Emergencies Act to it, but meantime, as you said, police cleared that and dealt with it before the Emergencies Act really took effect.
Tonda, let me turn to you. Federal cabinet ministers held another news conference today, and not sure about you, but I sensed a bit of a shift in the narrative to what measures might be needed if and when we get more protests and blockades, and not so much the narrative of urgency that surrounded the invocation of the measures back on Monday. Is it a tougher sell, emergency orders, for what might happen?
Well, I think yes, it's a tougher sell. I think what they're trying to do is say we are concerned about other blockades popping up, even though some have been resolved. However, I also think that in that news conference, we heard some extraordinary language around the ties or the alleged ties that the government suggests are between people arrested in Coutts and guns that were seized and people that were charged with conspiracy to murder police, and tying those individuals and those incidents to extremist leaders, allegedly extremist leaders in the organizers of the convoy. So there was very much a direct link, which we haven't heard anyone in the government make. And, for a couple of days, they've been talking about potentially, the ideologically, political and ideological leanings and motivations around this group. And today they kind of, said it's far-right extremism. And we hadn't heard that up until now. And that was a shift. That's a big shift, and perhaps an attempt to justify the usage of the act.
Joël-Denis, let me hear what your thoughts are on this, and how all of this is playing in Quebec, where the Premier said he doesn't support the emergency orders, doesn't need them. And here in Ottawa, the Bloc is certainly echoing that sentiment, coming out forcefully against these emergency orders.
Yeah, I would say that the fact that we managed to take away the barricades in Windsor and Coutts without the Emergency Act is weakening the narrative of the government. But as Tonda and Marieke just noted, the narrative, the sort of language that the government is using is also changing. They're talking about the potential of violence in the streets in Ottawa, namely, and they want to prevent other barricades. In Quebec, they feel that this is not necessary because everything is under control. However, there is another protest being organized from Quebec City over the weekend, and we'll see whether that will remain under control, because the organizer, Rambo Gauthier, is promising a more vigorous protest, if I may say, to be polite, for the Quebec authorities. So we'll have to watch whether what we've seen in Ottawa will be transported to Quebec City under another leadership that is very much contested in Quebec, Rambo-Gauthier.
Yeah. Let me talk about an incident we saw in question period today, and that was an Ontario MP, Conservative MP, Melissa Landsman, new MP, asking the Prime Minister a question, and he responded by saying, look, Conservatives can stand with swastikas, and went on to be critical of the Conservative response to these protests, Marieke. And I guess at a time when all parties are pointing the fingers at each other about divisiveness and the need to try and bring people back together, what do you make of the Prime Minister's that kind of response from the Prime Minister, given the climate we're in?
Well, it's a ratcheting up further of rhetoric, and I think it should be noted that Melissa Landsman is also Jewish. So I think to say that to a Jewish MP in the House of Commons raises a lot of questions, especially because, as I understand it, she has actually disavowed or did disavow those hateful symbols when they did pop up in that first weekend of the blockade. I think there are certainly questions for the Conservatives. Candice Bergen today said that they are the party of law and order and the blockades should leave. That was obviously not their message earlier, but that's not the same thing, even close, to saying you stand with swastikas.
Tonda, Melissa Landsman, she is the descendant of Holocaust survivors as well. What did you make of these comments when you heard them?
Look, I think what I think I heard, and I haven't gone back to re-listen to the tape, but as I think he said, and I'm not defending it because actually I think it is an overreach, but I think he said that he said Conservatives can stand with people who hold up the swastika, but on this side of the House, etc. So this is
right, with people who wave swastikas,
but not a distinction that makes a huge difference when you're the young Jewish woman MP on the other side of the House listening to that. And many MPs got up and expressed horror at the statement and demanded Trudeau retract his words. He ought to have quickly retracted them. On the other side of the House, on the Liberal side, a young Jewish woman who's a minister in the government stood up then and said, look, let's all take the temperature down. I too am of the family of Holocaust survivors. And she said, on the other side of the House, the big concern is that you're standing with people who want to overthrow democratically elected government. So honestly, the rhetoric was ridiculous today in the House of Commons. The Speaker upended the question order. He was so frustrated because he couldn't bring it back to under control. Yep. So if we've heard anything today, we didn't hear reasoned debate around the measures, what they mean, what they allow people, the authorities to do, and when there might be a horizon for an end to the blockades. What we heard was a lot of partisan divisions once more.
Right. This is these are different waters, uncharted waters to some extent for a lot of Canadians. Joël-Denis, some of us were around for the War Measures Act, but this is not that, let's be clear. But it is a big move by a government to invoke this kind of legislation for the first time since it was created in 1988. Would you expect I suppose, a more elevated tone around the debate for such an important time and for Canadians?
Absolutely. The Prime Minister has to lead by example and I would say tone down the rhetoric. And you might see more MPs like Liberal MP Joël-Denis come out and condemn the Prime Minister because his rhetoric is dividing Canadians, and that's pouring oil on gas on fire, if I may say. So expect maybe Liberal MPs like who have the same views as Joël-Denis, but haven't expressed them publicly, maybe to come out and condemn the Prime Minister over the next few days if Mr. Trudeau does not change his rhetoric, because clearly the partisanship is hitting new levels in the House of Commons, and it's not helping in the current crisis we see in Ottawa and we saw at the blockades at some border.
All right. Listen, the time is short tonight, but I want to thank you all for taking the time to speak with me about all this tonight. We'll talk again. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
That's all for another edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. I'm Peter Van Dusen from all of us here at CPAC. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.